The government killed the Aral Sea and almost kept it a secret. Once the fourth largest lake on the planet, it lost 90% of its water. Thousands of people were displaced. Sea creatures vanished completely. The land turned to poison. Then one man, Tanybergen Damatov, dared to say he had found a solution. He would resurrect the sea. What happened next shocked the entire world. The sea started coming back to life, and the story of how he did it will leave you completely breathless. The sea that died on purpose. In the 1950s, the Aral Sea was alive in a way that is hard to describe if you never saw it. Cold, vast, and full. Fishing boats went out before sunrise every single morning and came back heavy with catch. 40,000 tons of fish every year. Tens of thousands of families built their entire lives around this water. Towns grew up on its shores. It was the beating heart of Central Asia, fed by two massive rivers, the Sir Daria pushing in from the north and the Amu Daria from the south, pouring more than 56 billion cubic meters of water into that basin every single year. Over 1,000 cubic kilometers of water just sitting there, cold and full and alive. It was not going anywhere, or so everyone thought. Someone in Moscow looked at a map of Central Asia and made a decision that would murder that sea, out of pure burning ambition. The Soviet Empire wanted cotton, not a little cotton, all the cotton, enough to make the USSR the dominant cotton power on the entire planet. Cotton is one of the thirstiest crops on Earth. It needs enormous amounts of water to grow, more than almost anything else you can plant in the ground. Central Asia had the land and the heat. The only thing it did not have enough of was water. So Soviet engineers decided to do what Soviet engineers always did. They decided to redesign nature itself. Instead of letting the two great rivers flow where they had always flowed, they would rip that water away and redirect it onto the cotton fields. Simple, brilliant, and catastrophic beyond anything anyone admitted at the time. What they built was the largest irrigation network in human history, stretching across the dry plains and desert floors of Central Asia. 30,000 kilometers of canals. That is enough to wrap around the Earth twice. 45 dams. 80 reservoirs. The government celebrated it as one of the greatest engineering achievements in Soviet history. The engineers who designed it won the Stalin Prize, the highest honor the USSR gave to any civilian. Their names were printed in Pravda. They were given state dakas. They were treated like gods of industry, and not one of them said a single word about what their canals were doing to the sea, because they could not. Junior engineers working inside the system had seen the numbers. They knew the water flowing into the Aral Sea was dropping fast. They wrote internal reports, careful, documented, factual warnings that the inflow was collapsing. Those engineers were quietly reassigned. Others were angrily removed. In the Soviet system, standing up and saying that a celebrated project was killing a sea was called career destruction. So the warnings stopped. The reports disappeared. The senior engineers kept collecting their prizes and giving speeches, and the sea kept dying. 90% of those 30,000 kilometers of canals were not real canals at all. They were open trenches dug straight into loose desert sand with nothing lining the bottom. No concrete, no cover, just sand. Picture pouring water into a hole in the desert and watching it vanish before your eyes. That is what happened every single day across the entire network. Between 25 and 75% of every drop of water that entered those canals never reached a single cotton plant. It soaked straight into the ground. It evaporated into the dry air. It was gone before it got anywhere near a field. And the reason they built it this way was not a mystery. Lining canals with concrete costs money and takes time. The Soviet system was built on speed and hitting targets on paper. Nobody was being rewarded for doing it properly. They were being rewarded for doing it fast. So fast is what they did. And now think about what that means for the cotton. The sea was not being killed in exchange for a great harvest. The irrigated soil had no proper drainage system, so the water that did reach the fields just sat there and built up and pulled salt from deep in the earth up to the surface. By the 1980s, enormous sections of farmland had turned into white, crusted, completely dead saline wasteland. Nothing would grow there. The Aral Sea was sacrificed to water fields that poisoned themselves. The whole plan collapsed on both ends at the same time. The sea was gone, and the harvest it was murdered for was rotting in the ground. That is what happens when a system is built to celebrate ambition and punish anyone who tells the truth. By the 1980s, the water flowing into the Aral Sea had dropped from 56 billion cubic meters a year to zero. Not reduced, not slowed, Zero. And once the inflow stopped, a death cycle started that fed on itself and got faster every year. Less water meant the sea got shallower. Shallower water heats up faster under the Central Asian sun. Hotter water evaporates faster, which made the sea shallower still, which made it evaporate faster still. Round and round, the sea eating itself alive, and nobody stopped it. By 1987, the water level had dropped so far that the sea split in two. The North Aral sat in Kazakhstan, the South Aral sat in Uzbekistan, and 60,000 square kilometers of seabed, an area bigger than the entire country of Croatia, was suddenly sitting open and exposed under the sun. But this was not clean sand. For decades, every canal in Central Asia had been flushing agricultural runoff straight into this sea. Fertilizer, pesticides, heavy metals, all of it had been sinking to the bottom and building up year after year. Now it was exposed, dry, baked into a toxic white crust that stretched all the way to the horizon. 10 major storms a year tore across that crust and ripped it apart. When those storms hit, they did not just kick up sand. They tore into that poisoned seabed and launched everything sitting in it straight into the air. Fine white particles of salt mixed with decades of toxic chemical residue. All of it ground down into a powder light enough to travel thousands of kilometers. Without dropping dot, 20 million tons of it blasted into the sky every single year. People living in towns near the shore described the sky turning brown and the air tasting like chemicals. They shut their windows and pulled their children inside, but it got in anyway. It coated everything. It settled on crops, on water supplies, on skin. This was not ordinary dust. It carried DDT. It carried pesticides that had been banned across most of the world. It carried heavy metals that had been building in that seabed for 30 years. And it did not stay local. Wind systems picked it up and carried it across continents. Scientists later found traces of Aral dust in Arctic ice cores, in Norwegian glaciers, in blood samples taken from penguins in Antarctica. A sea dying in the middle of Central Asia was poisoning the other end of the planet, and the people living around it were being destroyed from the inside. Mothers drank water that was thick with pesticide runoff. Children breathed air carrying DDT particles off the exposed seabed. In some districts, right on the South Aral shore, the infant mortality rate climbed past 100 deaths for every 1,000 births. Tuberculosis rates in the region ran 5 to 10 times higher than the Soviet national average. The Soviet government's response was to classify the health data as a state secret. The population was dying, and the government's answer was to stop publishing the numbers. In Kazakhstan, the region sitting directly on the south shore, more than 80% of women of childbearing age were diagnosed with anemia. Doctors reported they had almost no healthy pregnancies left. An entire generation was being quietly poisoned while the government locked the door on every piece of information that proved it. And it was not just the people. The sea had its own creatures, animals that existed nowhere else on Earth and nowhere else in history. The Aral salmon, known scientifically as Salmotruta aralensis, had spent thousands of years evolving specifically inside this lake. It was not found anywhere else on the planet. By the time researchers tried to find it and document it, it was already gone. No one had taken a single photograph of a living specimen before the population collapsed. A creature that had taken millennia to become what it was got wiped off the face of the earth in less than 30 years. Nobody noticed until there was nothing left to save. And then there was Moynak. Moynak had been one of the great fishing ports of Central Asia. As the water retreated, fishermen dragged their boats further and further out across the growing desert floor, chasing a shoreline that kept moving away from them. And then one day the water was simply too far gone. The boats were left exactly where they sat. They are still there today. That image, those dead ships sitting in the sand pointing at nothing, became the face of what this disaster actually looked like. The world looked at those boats, shook its head and walked away convinced the sea was finished forever. But there were people who refused to walk away. And what they noticed, standing at one very specific point on the water's edge, was about to change everything. That point is called the Berg Strait. The people who refused to give up. The Berg Strait is a narrow channel of water sitting between the North Aral and the South Aral, connecting the two halves like a doorway between two rooms. A small group of engineers in Kazakhstan were standing at its edge watching water flow through it. To understand why this mattered so much, you need to picture the geography. The North Aral sat up top, the South Aral sat below it, and the Berg Strait was the opening between them. Fresh water from the Sirdarya River, water that had traveled hundreds of kilometers across Central Asia, was still arriving into the North Aral. That part was working. But the moment that water entered the North Aral, it hit the Berg Strait and poured straight through it like water finding a hole in a bucket. It drained down into the massive southern basin, where it spread out thin and flat across thousands of kilometers of exposed desert floor, and evaporated before it could do anything for anyone. Every single drop, gone. And here is what these engineers understood that nobody else had bothered to stop and notice. The two halves of the sea were not in the same situation at all. The South Aral was completely finished. It was enormous and flat, and its only water source, the Amu Darya River, had been fully consumed by Uzbekistan's cotton fields upstream. There was nothing flowing into the south anymore, and there was no way to change that without dismantling an entire country's agricultural system. The South Aral could not be saved. But the North Aral was a completely different story. It was deeper, it was narrower, and the Sirdarya was still flowing into it every single day. The only thing killing the North Aral was that one opening, the Berg Strait. Block it, and the water had nowhere to go but up. It was that simple, and nobody had done it. But there was something else the engineers knew that made this even more urgent. The Sirdarya itself was in serious trouble. Upstream irrigation was pulling so much water out of it that in some years the river ran completely dry before it ever reached the sea at all. The Amu Darya that fed the South Aral had already been bled to nothing by the cotton project. That was why the South Aral was dead. The Sirdarya was heading the same way. If they waited, even the North Aral's last lifeline would be gone. And there was something else that showed just how fast this was all happening. But someone decided to act very fast to save the North Aral. He was not an engineer or a scientist. His name was Tanybergen Damatov, and he was the mayor of Aralsk, a dying city that had once sat on the shore of a living sea. He decided he was going to block that strait himself. He had no engineering mandate, no real budget for something like this. He redirected local construction equipment and pulled municipal funds in ways that were well outside his legal authority. When word got back to the government about what he was planning, they did not just dismiss him, they laughed at him openly. They called him a foolish city mayor with a fleet of dump trucks trying to stop a dying sea. He did it anyway. Hundreds of dump trucks rolled to the edge of the Berg Strait. They carried sand and soil and rubble, whatever they could load and move. They dumped it into the water load after load across 13 kilometers of strait. It was rough and crude and had no concrete or engineering precision behind it. And then something happened that nobody, not even Damatov, had let himself fully believe would happen. The water level in the North Aral started to rise. Slowly at first, then steadily. Fish appeared in the North Aral for the first time in years. Fishermen who had completely given up dragged their boats back to the water and threw their nets in. Real catches started showing up at the Aralsk market for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Families rebuilt their income around those fish. Children swam in shoreline pools that had not existed in their lifetimes. The moisture in the air softened the burning desert heat in a way nobody in the region had felt in years. For 7 years, life held on to that fragile sand wall and refused to let go. And then, the spring of 1999 arrived, and it was about to unleash a bigger tragedy. Here is what happens every single spring in that region. The Tian Shan Mountains, sitting high above Central Asia, are buried under snow all winter long. When the temperature rises in spring, all of that snow melts at once and comes pouring down into the Sirdarya River. The river swells beyond its banks and charges forward with enormous force. It happens every year without fail, and every year that wall of rushing water had to go somewhere. The sand wall Damatov's team had spent years pouring truckload by truckload into the Berg Strait stood directly in its path. Every spring for 7 years, that same snowmelt had come charging down the Sirdarya and crashed into it. Every single year the wall took the hit and held on, but each flood left it weaker than before. It was never built to take this kind of punishment year after year. And in the spring of 1999, the river came down harder than it had in years. Hydrologists had been screaming about this for years. They knew that sand was getting weaker, but no one did anything about it. And yet workers were stationed there specifically because flood season had arrived and the risk was at its highest point. These men knew the wall was deteriorating. They had been told it might not hold. They stayed anyway because someone had to be standing there if it started to go. and then the snowmelt hit. The Syrdarya came roaring down and slammed into that sand wall with everything it had. The workers scrambled and screamed as the structure shook and buckled beneath the pressure. The wall crumbled and the water tore through the gap like a fist through paper. 2 workers were swallowed in the collapse. They did not make it out, and every single drop of water that had been building in the North Aral for 7 years, every fish, every family's hope, swept south through the broken strait and into the vast, dead southern basin. Once there, everything evaporated. The press called it the end. The government officials who had laughed at Damatov and refused to properly fund his project turned around and pointed straight at him. The man who had built something real from absolutely nothing, with no support and no resources, who had briefly brought a dying sea back to life, now faced the possibility of criminal charges for the deaths of the men who had believed in what he built. The sea was back at zero, and the world agreed it was finished. But then the World Bank engineers arrived to look at what was left of the broken structure, and they did not see a failure. They stood in the wreckage and they saw proof. The water had risen. The fish had come back. The ecosystem had responded almost immediately to the change in the water. The physics was right. The engineering was right. The sand was wrong. And that one distinction between a bad material and a bad idea was about to light the way to something nobody believed was still possible. The dam and the miracle. In 2001, the World Bank came back to Kazakhstan with a real proposal, $86 million. A real dam, built to last. The Kokaral Dam would run the same 13 kilometers across the Berg Strait that Damatov's trucks had tried to seal with rubble. But this version would be built with millions of tons of compacted earth reinforced with high-strength concrete. It was completed in August 2005. And the principle it worked on was so simple it is almost hard to believe it solved something this massive. Picture this. Take 1 liter of water and pour it onto a wide, flat baking tray. It spreads out thin and evaporates within hours. Now pour that same liter into a narrow, deep cup. It stays for days. Once the Kokaral Dam was built across the Berg Strait, it completely blocked off the opening that had been draining the North Aral into the south for decades. The North Aral was now cut off from the southern basin entirely, trapped inside its own deeper, narrower space. It stopped being a baking tray and became a cup. Less surface area exposed to the sun meant less evaporation. Less evaporation meant the water level rises. That is the whole idea. And here is something that should make your blood boil. When Kazakhstan presented the Kokaral Dam to international engineering bodies in the early 2000s, several Soviet-era hydrologists stood up and publicly said it would never work. These were not outside critics. These were the men who had designed the original irrigation network, who had built the system that drained the Aral Sea to its bones. They looked at the Kokaral Dam proposal and told the world it was a waste of money. Their objections were formally recorded and formally ignored. The dam worked in 7 months, but the engineers had not forgotten 1999. They had not forgotten the flood or the 2 workers who died or the 7 years that disappeared overnight. So they built 9 digital gates into the dam's spillway. When the Syrdarya floods each spring and the water rises too high, those gates open and release 600 cubic meters of water per second in a controlled flow to the south. The dam would not be overwhelmed. It would breathe. And every time those gates opened, the rushing water flushed the concentrated salt sitting at the bottom of the North Aral out through the strait, cleaning the lake from the inside like a kidney working continuously every single season. But those 9 gates were protecting something else too, something almost nobody talks about. During the decades when the sea was dying and the shoreline kept pulling back, people had started building on the exposed seabed. Homes and structures and small communities settled on ground that used to be underwater, ground that would be underwater again if the dam worked. Without those gates, a large spring flood could have caused the North Aral to rise so fast that those settlements would have been swallowed before anyone could react. People who had moved onto the Dead Sea floor had no idea the sea was coming back. The 9 gates stood between them and a disaster they never saw coming. At the same time, tens of millions of dollars went into lining more than 2,000 kilometers of Syrdarya canals with concrete, finally sealing the trenches that had been bleeding water into the sand for 50 years. Workers did this in desert heat that reached 50 degrees Celsius. They had to finish before the dam gates closed because if the canals still leaked, the The water savings would be lost before a single drop reached the sea. The canal work and the dam construction had to finish in exactly the right sequence. One step out of order, and neither would function. When the dam was sealed, international experts sat down and made their calculation. Based on the volume of water coming in, the evaporation rates, the size of the basin, they worked out how long it would take the North Aral to reach its target depth of 42 meters. 3 to 5 years, they said, minimum. Everyone agreed on that number. Now stop for a second, because what happened next made every single one of those experts wrong. It took 7 months. 7 months! By early 2006, the water level had risen by 3.5 meters. The total volume of water in the North Aral doubled, jumping from 14 billion to 27 billion cubic meters. The coastline that had retreated 100 kilometers across the desert came rushing forward and stopped just 25 kilometers from the city of Aralsk. A city that had not seen its sea in decades woke up and found the water coming back toward it. Gravity and geometry had done in 7 months what every expert on the planet said would take 5 years. But that was not even the most shocking part. Before the dam, the North Aral's salt content sat at 30 grams per liter. To understand what that means, the open ocean runs at about 35 grams per liter. The North Aral had become almost as salty as the sea itself. No native fish could survive in it. Nothing could live there. But as the Kokaral Dam flushed out the old salt and held in the fresh water from the Sirdarya, the salt content started falling, down from 30, down past 20, down past 10, until it hit 8 grams per liter. And 8 grams is a very specific number. Below 10 grams per liter, native fish eggs can survive. Larvae can hatch. Life can start again. The chemical doors swung open, and nobody had to do anything else. No fish were released into the North Aral. No plants were transplanted. No species were brought back by human hands. The engineers fixed the water and walked away, and the sea remembered what it was. 22 fish species that had retreated far upstream into the Sirdarya River, surviving in polluted and barely livable conditions, felt the chemical change in the water downstream, and they swam home. Pike perch, bream, carp, roach, species that had been gone for decades came flooding back into the North Aral completely on their own. And they did not trickle back slowly. They exploded. Within 2 years, pike perch catches in the North Aral were exceeding the levels from before the crisis. Coastal vegetation spread across thousands of hectares. More than 300 species of migratory birds and wild animals came back. And then, before most of the fish had even fully settled, the flamingos arrived. Within months of the water rising, flocks of flamingos appeared on the North Aral shoreline. The first flamingos anyone had seen there in over 20 years. They came before the scientists expected anything to return, feeding on algae and brine shrimp blooming in the freshening water. Local fishermen who saw them said that nobody born after the sea started dying had ever seen a flamingo at the Aral before. From 0 commercial fish caught, the North Aral was now pulling 8,000 tons per year. 12 fish processing plants rose along the coast. More than 3,000 fishermen went back to work. And then the people started coming home, young people who had grown up watching their parents' boats rust in the desert sand, people who had moved to Almaty and Tashkent and built entirely new lives far away. They packed their things and drove back. Villages like Tastubek, where only a handful of exhausted old men had stayed behind, watched the number of homes triple, a reverse migration that had never happened before in the history of Central Asia. They came home because the sea came home first. And then there were the children. An entire generation had grown up in Aralsk without ever once seeing water on the horizon. Their parents had described a sea they could not picture. When teachers started organizing trips to the newly accessible shoreline, these children, who had never seen open water larger than a river, stood at the edge and went completely quiet. Local accounts described them standing there unable to move, unable to fully believe that what they were looking at was real. A sea their grandparents had fished, that their parents had watched die, had come back within their own lifetime. The fish were back, the birds were back, the people were back. Life had returned to a place the whole world had written off as gone forever. But while the North was coming back to life, something was rotting on the other side of that dam. And what was happening down there was its own kind of horror. 2 futures. Stand on the Kokaral Dam and look north. You see water, open and blue and alive. Now turn around and look south. Flat, cracked desert stretching all the way to the horizon. And sitting on that cracked earth, oil rigs and gas drills. One concrete wall, 13 kilometers long, is the entire difference between those two worlds. The Amu Darya that feeds the south was never restored. Uzbekistan continued to bleed it dry for agriculture. No dam was built in the south. No intervention was made. The exposed southern seabed, far larger and more open than the north, kept generating toxic dust storms that ripped across the region and traveled thousands of kilometers into the atmosphere. The communities of Kazakhstan, sitting right on the South Aral shore, got no recovery plan. What they got were energy extraction licenses. The natural gas deposits that had sat under the water for millennia were now sitting in open air, and companies moved drilling equipment onto a seabed still soaked with 50 years of pesticide contamination and heavy metal residue. The South Aral was not mourned, it was monetized. The Aral Sea is not coming back. Not the whole sea. Not the sea from the 1960s. 68,000 square kilometers of water surface are gone from the world map, and they are not coming back ever. The South is dead. The poison is still moving. The dust storms are still tearing 20 million tons of contaminated particles into the sky every year from that southern basin. The people of Kazakhstan are still living next to that, still breathing it, still drinking water downstream of it. They did not get a miracle. They got gas drills on the floor of their dead sea and a government that looked the other way. The North was saved, the South was abandoned, and the line between those two outcomes is 13 kilometers of concrete in the Berg Strait. The Sinus 2 project is running right now, a plan to raise the Kokaral Dam by 2 to 4 more meters, pushing the water level from 42 meters up to 46. The water volume would climb from 27 billion to 34 billion cubic meters. The surface area of the North Aral would expand by another 1,000 square kilometers. 167 engineering projects are active across the entire Sirdarya Basin. Laser land leveling on agricultural fields, automated sensors tracking every drop of water, subsidies pushing farmers to switch to drip irrigation. The goal is to save 500 million cubic meters of water every year and send it straight into the North Aral. And here is the number that makes all of that matter most: 46 meters. At a water level of 46 meters, the calculations say the water will reach the rusted cranes and abandoned docks of Aralsk harbor. Aralsk was once a thriving port city sitting right on the shore of the Aral Sea. Ships came and went. Fishermen loaded their catches onto boats that sailed out every morning. The harbor was the heartbeat of the entire city. Then the sea retreated and took everything with it. The cranes and docks were left standing exactly where they were, frozen in time, surrounded by nothing but sand and silence for 50 years. The cranes that have been pointing at empty desert ever since. For the first time in more than half a century, Aralsk would be a coastal city again. The water is rising. The cranes are waiting. And for the first time in a very long time, there is a real reason to believe the sea is going to make it all the way home.